Allora facciamo entrare gli ospiti. Benissimo, allora stanno entrando i nostri ospiti. Buonasera, buonasera a tutti. Good evening, everybody. Grazie di passare questo pomeriggio di tempo bellissimo con noi. Thank you very much, everybody, for connecting with us through Zoom, and also you can watch us live on YouTube. Welcome, benvenuti a Dante in Boston Museums, another event to commemorate the 700th anniversary of Dante Alighieri's death in 1321. I am Chiara Durazzini and I am a member of the Dante Alighieri Society of Massachusetts Cultural Committee. And this is our second event to commemorate Dante Alighieri's death for the Centenario after our January's lecture by Professor Lino Pertile, if you remember. And in fact, for the Settecentenario, we at the Dante decided to take a multidisciplinary or multidiscipline approach. In fact, in January, we talked about literature, and today we will talk about arte, with our guest, Daniela Carrabino. Ciao, Daniela. Now, please remember that our third event to commemorate Dante's death will be in September with music, with our fourth and final installment of Momenti Musicali, hopefully in person. Today's presentation is organized in collaboration with the Circolo Italiano di Boston, and here we have Susan Angelastro to represent the Circolo. Ciao Susan, benvenuta, un piacere vedere te e la mia Firenze nello sfondo. Grazie. And the event is also under the auspices of the Consulate General of Italy in Boston, and we have the pleasure to have Professor Adamo Castelnuovo, the direttore dell'Ufficio Scolastico del Consolato. Buonasera professore, come va?
Buonasera Chiara, buonasera a tutti voi.
Yes, please say a few words for the Consolato.
Sure, thank you for having me here. Thank you to the Dante Alighieri Society for organizing this event, to the Circolo Italiano di Boston, and to Professor Carrabino for this upcoming lecture. As you know, as a consulate in the last few years, we have organized or co-sponsored many events related to the Italian culture, including a few field trips to some museums with a bunch of students, usually small groups of students from all over our consular jurisdiction. Plus, many events related to Dante have been celebrated, mostly online, unfortunately, as you know, and many others will be celebrated in the remainder of this year. But today, for the first time, visual art and literature match in an exciting virtual talk on the greatest work of our beloved Dante. And so I never studied anything about this topic. I didn't know that there were significant influences of our poem in Boston Museum's art. So I'm excited for this event. Dante's poem is art itself, and now we are going to talk about the poem in art, the art in poem. My greatest wish is that we can enjoy this speech as if we were like kids on a treasure hunt. This is what I'm thinking about. Thank you, everyone, and I'll give the floor back to you, Chiara.
Grazie, grazie Adamo, and thanks again to the Consulate for always supporting us. We truly appreciate it. And
Thank
now,
you.
Susan, please, would you like to say a few words for the Circolo? And maybe you can introduce our speaker today.
Thank you very much, Chiara. Good evening, buonasera a tutti, and also to my fellow panelists. I do represent the Circolo Italiano di Boston, which is a group very much like the Dante. We've been around for more than 100 years here in Boston. I was thinking as I was preparing for tonight, Dante has been uniting individuals for centuries now. One reason, of course, because he wrote the Divine Comedy in lingua volgare as opposed to Latino, so that everyone could read it. And here we are 700 years later, and he's still uniting us through events such as this. And so in speaking with Chiara through these past months when we were talking about events and whatnot, and again, reaching out and collaborating as so many of us want to do during this pandemic time, I was thrilled that the Circolo Italiano of Boston could collaborate and come together on this very important event. May is, of course, the month that Dante was born, and here we are celebrating his death. And we're very, very pleased that we could come into collaboration with you. So thank you very much. It's also, apart from seeing my good friend Chiara on screen, it's wonderful to be able to present a friend of ours, Danielle Carrabino, and fellow San Nicoloniana. Danielle Carrabino is curator of painting and sculpture at the Smith College Museum of Art, where she oversees art from antiquity until 1950. She has worked in various museums, including the National Museum of Women in Art, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the Harvard Art Museums. In addition to her curatorial experience, she has taught art history at the undergraduate and graduate levels in the United States, England, and of course in Italy. She has presented her research in Italian Renaissance and Baroque art at conferences and has published articles, chapters in edited books, and exhibition catalogs. Her book manuscript, nearing completion, is based on her doctoral dissertation concerning Caravaggio and Sicily. And I know we're all waiting till that is completed so we too can be on the ground floor and hear that. Very pleased to present Danielle Carrabino, who will speak about Dante in museums in Boston. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Susan. And now let's see Dante in Boston museums. Vai, Daniela.
Grazie a tutti. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you to the Dante Alighieri Society. Thank you to the Circolo Italiano di Boston. Thank you to the Italian Consulate. And thank you all for coming. As we said, it's a beautiful day outside. It's one of the first, and so I really appreciate you being with us this evening. I will actually begin sharing my screen without further ado. And let's see if this works. Okay. Hopefully you can all see that. So I just wanted to say this will be as the introductory remarks said, not a talk about literature, but a talk about Dante and how he influenced art. And that's actually a huge topic. And so I was able to narrow it by keeping it within Boston museums. This is a topic that has come up again and again in my work as a curator, first at Harvard and now at Smith College, where professors will come to me, students will come to me and they'll say, I'm studying Dante. What do you have in your museum that I can learn about him through art? And it's a wonderful challenge that I've been able to have again and again to look through these collections and explore specifically to find works that were influenced by Dante. And so this has been something that I've thought about for several years now. But I wanted to expand it to the Boston public collections as well. And just to kind of reiterate that this is not a talk about the Divine Comedy per se, it's not really a talk about the literature per se, but about how influential Dante has been to art. And I would like to explore that that idea a little further. Because we are not together in person, and that's always the best way to see art, I think I would say that I'm going to kind of exploit Zoom a little bit tonight and do things that we're not able to do in person. So we'll be visiting 3 Boston museums tonight, and actually one other site in Boston toward the end, which is something we could never do together in an hour if we were in person. And I'm also going to take you behind the scenes a little bit. A lot of the works that you'll see tonight are not actually on view, and that might be a little disappointing, but the reason for that is because many of them are on paper. They're works on paper. Paper is light sensitive and it can't be shown for long periods of time. So we'll do something that maybe can't be done in person to make the Zoom experience a little more interesting. So I'd like to begin with just some questions to keep in the back of your mind, things that I'll be thinking about throughout the talk with you. I'll just briefly introduce who Dante and the Divine Comedy, what the Divine Comedy was, who Dante was. I won't get into that in any detail. I'm assuming this audience knows a lot about those, probably more than me, in fact, in many cases. But I would like to introduce him through a series of portraits. And think about how he is kind of imagined still today. And then I'd like to talk about where we can find art together in Boston that has to do with Dante. But as I was alluding to, why was Dante, why is he so prevalent in Boston? What is it about Boston collections that have continued to collect work that has to do with his art? And so I'll explore some of the ideas behind that question. And why has Dante's poem had such a profound influence on art? And so that's something that will kind of run throughout the course of my talk as a thread that we can maybe discuss at the end. We'll leave time for some question and discussion at the end. Okay, so I think this is just a very appropriate place for us to start in Florence. This is obviously where Dante was born, and it's really hard to talk about Dante without talking about Florence. The two are completely intertwined. As you know, Florence comes up again and again in his writing, both in positive and in negative light. And this is it's actually a 19th century painting that is based on a much earlier work from the 14th, actually end of the 14th, beginning of the 15th century. And the reason I'm showing it here is because this is not how the city looked when Dante was born, or even when he died. But there's something about kind of the walled city and the circle that might have had something to do with the way that he organizes his Divine Comedy. And again, this is something that I'm sure people have written about much more extensively than I'm prepared to talk about tonight. But the kind of concentric circles of the walls of Florence might kind of resonate when one reads the Divine Comedy, especially. And I will continue here. So thinking about, one of the most important moments of Dante's life, and again, I won't really get into his life in this talk, but a pivotal moment is when he sees Beatrice. Again, Florence is in the background here, and this is kind of a moment that you have to understand when you talk about Dante. Beatrice is everything for Dante. His great love, his muse, the kind of unrequited love, and is very much inspirational, but also very present as the guide in the Paradiso. This is actually a postcard from the Isabella Gardner Museum. As I said, a lot of these works are on paper, a lot of these works are not visible, but I wanted to share this with you because it kind of encapsulates both that idea of Dante seeing Beatrice, falling in love with her. He actually had seen her for the first time when he was 9 and she was 8. He says he immediately falls in love with her. And then unfortunately for him, they're both married to different people, but he sees her several times in life. And so this is kind of a trope that people pick up on and illustrate often in art as this great moment, this kind of colpo di fulmine, right? This this lightning bolt of love. It's this kind of semi-divine figure. And the other reason I'm showing it is because it's from the 19th century. And actually, most of the works that I will show tonight are from the 19th century. That was really a moment when Dante comes back into art as this huge influence. A lot of the artists that are thinking about Dante also happen to be poets. As we'll see, a lot of them even translated some of his work. And so there's this kind of image and text marriage in the 19th century that Dante is kind of very prevalent in, and the art about Dante is actually very relevant too. As you see at the bottom, tutti I miei pensieri parlan d'amore, so all of my thoughts speak of love. This is from the Vita Nuova, sonnet 13. The Vita Nuova is another great work that Dante penned, which is both kind of verse and prose. And again, it really is about the moment when Beatrice dies and his kind of mourning as he's writing it. And she'll come back into our discussion, as will the Vita Nuova. So I just wanted to kind of introduce it here quickly. Moving on. This is another work that's not in Boston, but I wanted to just kind of show to kind of illustrate what I'll be talking about. This is Domenico di Michelino. This is a fresco in the Duomo in the Cathedral of Florence after Alesso Baldovinetti from 1465. This is just a great image. If no one has ever heard of Dante, which is very rarely the case, it just encapsulates everything in one image. So at the center, you see Dante he's usually shown in a red cloak, as we'll see, crowned in laurel as the poet that he is, often holding his Divine Comedy as he is here. And he's gesturing to the kind of image of the Inferno. So the Divine Comedy, as you well know, is divided into three parts: the Inferno, which he's gesturing to, Purgatorio or Purgatory in the background there, and on the right, Paradiso, which not surprisingly is Florence itself in this case, the kind of earthly paradise that Florence was for many Florentines, and actually still is today. Let's keep going. So I wanted to share that because without having that image and understanding of that image and where it exists, it's hard to understand a work like this. So this is an image, again, it's a postcard, a work on paper from the MFA. And it's, just based on that image. There are a lot of postcards that we find in Boston collections. And I find that curious because maybe today we don't think about postcards as being art. But many of the postcards have to do with Dante. And so it's interesting to think that these are the works of art that people are reproducing to send back from their travels. And they're not of, photographs. They are actually works of art and often of Dante. So when you visit Florence, there was a kind of trend to send back images of Dante, not even Florence itself, but he kind of stands for Florence. He is in many ways Florence. So we'll see a few more examples of this as we go through the collections. Let's keep going. Okay. This is another postcard actually from the MFA. And again, I'll share with you an image of what it is based on. The reason I'm showing you this is because it is, as I said, I wanted to introduce you to Dante through portraiture, the way that he has been shown over and over in art, often in profile, as I said, often in red. And the profile, because of his nose, he has in the kind of artistic imagination, often he is shown with this hooked, very prominent nose, and that's often repeated over and over and over again. It's recently been proven that that probably was not the case. So I find it interesting that this is how we think of him, and it's largely because of the way that he has been portrayed in art. In this case, he doesn't have that kind of aquiline hooked nose that we see over and over again. And this is perhaps because it's based on one of the first images of Dante painted while he was still alive, reportedly by Giotto. So here we are in the Cappella del Bargello. This is the Cappella della Maddalena in the Bargello Museum. And this is, as we see on the lower slide here, which is a bit damaged, you will see Dante is one of the figures in profile to the left. The image that I just showed you is based exactly on this image. I've enlarged it on the right there. And then to give you a bit more context, this is where it is on the wall when you enter the chapel. So it's a little high up. Now I said it's been attributed to Dante. That's probably not the case. But again, this is kind of this, it's a motif that gets repeated again and again, thanks to Giorgio Vasari, who wrote the lives of the artists. And he writes about how Giotto painted Dante from life. The years don't quite match up. And so this was probably couldn't be Dante, probably couldn't be Giotto. However, he was really the greatest artist of his time. Dante was the greatest literary genius of his time. And so it's very kind of common that we would unite these two and have them come together. Also because the way that Dante writes is very evocative of imagery, which is one of the things that we'll explore a little more throughout the talk. And Giotto is also known for being one of the first kind of naturalistic painters. And I've just put some, I've peppered this talk with some quotes from the Divine Comedy that might refer in some way to the images that we'll be seeing. But Dante actually talks about Giotto in his Divine Comedy and how he surpassed Cimabue, the greatest artist of Dante's time. And then how Giotto soon surpasses him and shadows him in fame. So he has this kind of praise for Giotto. Moving on. Also, based on this idea of Giotto painting Dante is this work from the Harvard Art Museums. This is actually a preparatory study for a work now at the Tate Museum in London. This is Dante Gabriele Rossetti, who is a great 19th century artist, also a poet. And as you can tell, a great fan of Dante. He actually changed the order of his name. Dante was not his first name, so that he would also be Dante. So he very much kind of sees himself as the reincarnation of this great artist, poet. This is from 1859. As I said, it's at the Harvard Art Museums, and it's a gouache, watercolor, graphite. So it's essentially a drawing. And we have here, as you can see, Giotto actually in the act of painting Dante's portrait. What you see on the wall is the image that I just showed you. So this is kind of a historic reenactment, if you will, of that moment. And Dante Gabriele Rossetti is thinking about how that encounter must have been with these two greats side by side. I should also say that Rossetti, we'll see a little bit more of him a little later on. His father was actually a Dante scholar. So Dante was very prevalent in his life. And he actually is one of the founders of what was known as the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. The Pre-Raphaelites were a group of artists who thought that art had kind of declined after Raphael, or beginning with Raphael. And so they go back to a moment before that for their inspiration. And so Dante, but also the great artists of his time, are very much present in the mind of the Pre-Raphaelite brotherhoods. Just a kind of interesting fact, the finished version of this painting, there are several versions of it. As I said, one is in the Tate, one is actually in the collection of Sir Andrew Lloyd Webber. And so this is kind of an interesting thing to think of, another kind of great of our time collecting an image like this. Dante holds a pomegranate. Pomegranate is a symbol of immortality. And so, as I said, here we have this idea that Dante Gabriel Rossetti is kind of paying homage to not only Dante, but also Giotto, and thinking about art in particular, but also literature, I would say, as a way to achieve immortality. So, you know, the way that your art lasts longer than the human life. So vita brevis ars longa, you know, these are the things that will continue to live on, art and literature, and also music and theater, of course, and dance. Okay, moving on. So this is another work in the Harvard Art Museums. This is Dante and Petrarca, so two of the great poets of Italian literature. This is an artist called Giovanni dal Ponte from Florence, about 1430. And it's tempera and gold on panel. Now, this is a fragment. This is not the whole ensemble. This was probably a part of a cassone, which is a wedding chest. And we have located, I worked on this when I was at the Harvard Art Museums. We've located a few other panels around the world. And it's likely that this was part of an ensemble that represented the 7 liberal arts. And so here we have Dante and Petrarch standing in for literature. Again, holding their volumes. As I said, Dante's often in red. He holds his Divine Comedy in profile with the hooked nose again, and he's being crowned here by an angel. Unfortunately, the paint has worn off, but originally he would have been crowned with the laurel of the poets, the wreath that you see Petrarca wearing in this case. So this is kind of the more typical portrait of Dante that you would see. So here we are in the 15th century, and it's pretty much established from this point on. Okay, for a more literal portrait, this is a copy of a death mask of Dante Alighieri from the late 19th century. This is in the Isabella Gardner Museum. Isabella Gardner is one of the key protagonists of our talk tonight, and I'll come back to her in just a moment. This is probably not a death mask that was taken from Dante in any way. It was probably taken after a few different ones. And so the fact that he has the hooked nose, we don't really know where that comes from, because as I said, it's been disproven that he has that profile, but this is kind of feeding into that myth that by the 19th century was definitely well established. So to kind of move on and talk about some of the key people who really bring Dante to Boston in the 19th century. These are key figures. So from left to right, Isabella Stewart Gardner, Charles Eliot Norton, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, and James Russell Lowell. Just a few words about each of these. Isabella Stewart Gardner, you know her from her museum. She's one of the great private collectors of the 19th century. And unlike the public museum, the MFA right around the corner, her collection was largely grown for her own pleasure and her own taste. It was during her lifetime that she did want to share her collection with many people, and eventually had the idea to turn it into a museum. But often when we have these private collections, they are according to someone's taste, rather than something like the MFA that is collected for the kind of general public. And she very much acquired a taste for Dante. She really came to know him and love him through Charles Eliot Norton, who you see here in the second photograph from the left. He was a Harvard professor, and someone who lectured on Dante and who drew large crowds. He started lecturing in 1878. And Mrs. Gardner would often, as I said, attend these lectures. He also started to help Isabella Stewart Gardner collect early editions of Dante. And it's maybe a little known fact that Gardner started to collect books, rare books, beginning with Dante. And then that led to her love of art. She had traveled extensively in Europe, but it was really when she started collecting books that eventually she started to collect art. So she kind of enters collecting very much through Dante, actually. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow was also a professor at Harvard of Italian. He was a poet, as many of you know. He translated the Divine Comedy in 1867, which was actually one of the first American translations, one of the first in English, and actually one of the most successful. Some people still use Longfellow today. Together with James Russell Lowell, who was a Romantic poet, Norton, Longfellow, and Russell started an informal Dante club in 1863 and eventually inaugurated in 1881 the Dante Society, and that would eventually grow to become the Dante Alighieri Society that we have today. So the roots really were with these three men. Norton invited Mrs. Gardner to be part of the society, which she was. And so if you can imagine, these are the people who really are kind of ushering in a love for Dante and in the 19th century. One of the things that Norton tells Gardner is on the market is a Divine Comedy called the Aldine Dante from 1502 with what he calls very curious and interesting woodcuts. And we have letters between them that actually document this. This is a page from the Aldine Dante. I'm showing a scene from Purgatory here, from the Wrathful and the Slothful. And we have this kind of imagery that we'll see again and again, this very vivid imagery that's taken from the Divine Comedy that translates very well into works like this, so that we have Virgil and Dante, as you see, they're kind of progressing up Mount Purgatory and visiting these souls, or looking at these souls who are actually stuck in sticks. They're stuck in the mud. They were the wrathful and are being destroyed by their own anger. This is a 15th century anonymous engraving, but after Sandro Botticelli from 1481. This is in the Harvard Art Museums. This is the first canto of the Inferno. And what we have here is when you're reading from left to right, just like you would a book, we have Dante in the forest, nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita. As you all know, he finds himself in a dark wood, is kind of lost, and then it comes upon these three beasts. And so what you see here are the three beasts: the she-wolf, the lion, and the leopard. And then there's Virgil, who will be his guide through both Inferno and Purgatorio. And so this is kind of illustrating that canto and opening up the Divine Comedy. Many of you might have seen at the MFA a few years ago in 2017, Botticelli and the Search for the Divine. And on exhibition were images like this from the illustrated, the Botticelli, actually, the illustrated Dante, and many of Isabella Stewart Gardner's own rare books were part of that exhibition. So just kind of introducing you to this idea of the books that were also collected, the illustrated books that exist in Boston. This is a view of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum courtyard on the right, and a case with some of her oldest editions of Dante. There is the theory that perhaps Fenway Court, which is where her house, which became a museum, is located, is kind of a visual translation of the Paradiso itself. I'll credit here Linda Docherry for this idea. It's this idea of the kind of spiritual love and heavenly beauty that comes together, that is very much evocative of Dante's Paradiso itself. And so she's kind of inspired to create a kind of earthly paradise for herself. Also, the idea that a public museum was created from her collection, and this was very much something she wanted for Boston's, youth, but also the general public to enjoy, which might align with this idea that Dante puts forth of one's free will. I'd just like to switch gears now and talk about some of the works that are not illustrating per se, but are inspired by. So this is not from a volume of Dante. This is a separate sheet from the Harvard Art Museums from about 1500, which is the Inferno according to Dante. So this is where we get into some of the ideas of artists who are inspired by Dante to create their own vision of the Divine Comedy. And here, of course, we see the 9 circles of hell with Lucifer at the center with his 3 faces devouring the 3 traitors, Brutus and Julius, Julius, Cassius, and Judas. And we have here kind of this very vivid imagery that Dante writes translated into these kind of grotesque monsters, but also the tortured souls. It's really exciting, I think, for artists to be able to illustrate parts of the Divine Comedy, or to kind of think about and imagine his words and what they look like, because Dante is a very visual poet. And so to be able to kind of give license to these artists to create these fantastic images is, I think, one of the reasons why art has so been deeply influenced by Dante and his writing. As I said, the 19th century is a huge moment for Dante and his kind of revival. This is a work by William Blake, another poet, also artist, who very much sees himself as a kind of reincarnation of Dante. This is at Harvard. It's a watercolor from about 1825 or so. There are several series of illustrations of the Divine Comedy in Boston museums, and this is one of them. And I should actually say this is not at all a comprehensive talk. There are many other works that I won't have time to show you tonight, but this is one of probably the most well-known is Blake's Divine Comedy series. And he very much, as I said in the previous slide, takes kind of creative license and interprets as well as, reads Dante, but very much uses his artistic license to think about how he can transform Dante's words into this vivid imagery. Blake illustrated over 100 scenes from the Divine Comedy. 23 of them are in the Harvard Art Museums. The one I selected here is Agnello di Brunelleschi of Florence, who's being transformed into a serpent. This is one of those moments that is really, I think, exciting for an artist, because this is not something you can study in nature. How do you show a human being, or a soul in this case, being transformed into a serpent? And he actually captures that transformation kind of in the middle. So this is very kind of torturous transformation, as you see. He's kind of writhing in pain, and then the serpent is taking over his body. It's very exciting. It's very kind of gruesome. Here we have another one of the most prevalent themes, or prevalent scenes rather, in the Divine Comedy. This is Paolo and Francesca from Canto 25. And we have the kind of swirl, the storm of the souls of the lustful. And we have Paolo and Francesca kind of at center here, as they kind of are trying to embrace each other. Of course, as you know, the contrappasso, the kind of idea that when you sin in life, is the kind of punishment that you receive in hell. It's kind of the opposite of what you are having to endure because of what you did while you were alive. And Dante famously is so moved by Paolo Francesca's story. He takes such pity on them that he faints. And so this is the scene, again, by Blake. This is an engraving instead. Where Blake has shown Dante completely prone on the ground, passed out from his kind of pity. Moving now to the MFA. This is a French artist, always in the 19th century, 1859. This is Jean-Baptiste Camille Corot. So Corot is one of the great landscape artists. This is his Dante and Virgil. I've tried to, as you see, indicate images that are on view, so that when you have the chance, you can go and actually see these works. This one happens to be on view at the MFA. This was a painting that that Corot presented at the 1859 Salon, the Paris Salon, which was really the greatest moment you could show your work as an artist. And again, we see this kind of opening canto of the Divine Comedy where we have Virgil, the guide of Dante, and the three beasts in this kind of very kind of ferocious encounter, but really being overtaken by the dark wood that Dante describes, and really as a landscape artist, kind of Corot using his capacity to be able to take that into a kind of literary illustration. So really creating this kind of ominous setting for this, this scene. This is quite a different illustration that we see by a much later artist. This is Robert Rauschenberg from 1964, one of the few 20th century images that I'll show tonight, but there are many other series that are illustrated. This is his illustrations for Dante's Inferno, again, from the Harvard Art Museums. And Rauschenberg actually worked directly with a scholar, a Dante scholar, to try to create these illustrations. And he actually combined drawings and watercolors and transferred images from magazines. And he incorporates people like John F. Kennedy, Olympic athletes. So he really brings the 20th century into his Divine Comedy, which is something I think that is really interesting because the Divine Comedy is very resonant still with us today. I'm just going to move along here. I'm cognizant of time and I want to get to some questions toward the end. This is also on view, a bronze sculpture of Dante and Virgil, again, from the MFA. From about 1860. This one has on the scroll a quotation that I've posted here from Purgatory. And this is, again, on view, very much in the guise of kind of a recast of a classical sculpture. So thinking of Dante as the great classic poet, which Virgil, of course, was, but kind of taking the next generation as the great poet. Another work from the MFA, this one is also on view. This is from the great 19th century sculptor Canova, Antonio Canova. This is a bust of Beatrice from about 1820. I wanted to bring this in because it brings us not only into Paradiso with Beatrice, this is an image of Beatrice, but because it was originally conceived as a woman, Juliette Recamier, and the portrait did not please her. And so what does Canova do? He basically idealizes it and makes it into Beatrice, which is very fitting because Beatrice herself becomes this idealized woman and something that is almost unattainable. And then the white, pure marble, of course, the unblemished, is very much kind of in keeping with this idea. But she's also very much of her time, like the Rauschenberg. She has the hairstyle of a 19th century Parisian woman. Again, skipping ahead to Paradiso, this is from a Dutch artist, Ari Scheffer, from 1851. This is a painting. And again, we have on the frame verses that I've shown here from the Paradiso. And again, kind of bringing Beatrice back into the picture, showing Dante is just kind of in awe of her. In the painting, she's placed above him, kind of unattainable. He is gazing as he looks up, but also points up to heaven. Of course, as I said, she is his guide and also his muse. And so this is something that I think is captured very much in this painting. Back to Dante Gabriel Rossetti from 1871. This is a watercolor from the Harvard Art Museums. This is actually a reproduction of an oil painting. And Dante Gabriel Rossetti, again, alluding here to Dante, he had actually just lost his wife. So his wife is imaged here. This is a portrait of a posthumous portrait of Elizabeth Siddons, who Siddle, excuse me, who had just recently died, who he imagines as Beatrice. And so we have here this kind of, again, conflation between Dante and Rossetti, Beatrice and his wife, and this idea that because she is the dove for him. Rossetti called her his dove. He shows her with this dove, which has a kind of halo and a poppy this kind of immortalizing image, the sundial, and then Dante in the background with an allegorical figure of love, and then in the distant background, Florence itself. So again, kind of how Dante is reimagined in one's own present for many of these artists. I know we are almost out of time, just going to wrap up with a quick visit to the Boston Public Library, which is often not thought of as a museum, but actually has many wonderful works of art. This particular one is from 1890 to 1919. It's by the great artist John Singer Sargent, who actually decorated the third floor of the Boston Public Library with the theme called The Triumph of Religion. And this is kind of not inspired by Dante per se. However, I would argue that his image of paradise and his image of hell very much evoke Dante. And the reason I say that is because Sargent was actually born in Florence. He traveled throughout Europe. He studied both at the Accademia delle Belle Arti in Florence, but also in Paris. And eventually ended up in London, but he was very much in contact with Isabella Stewart Gardner via Henry James, actually. He painted Isabella Stewart Gardner's portrait. And I think he was thinking of Dante. I have no basis for saying this other than just looking. We actually have the preparatory studies at my museum at the Smith College Museum of Art. This is the preparatory work for Heaven, and this is Hell, and there's the preparatory work. These are the two together as they are described by Sargent himself. And I think just reading how Sargent talks about these is very much evocative of Dante. And so I think I'll just kind of leave you with that idea of thinking about how sometimes it's not kind of an illustration per se, but Dante seeps into artists' imagination constantly. To conclude, I just wanted to kind of wrap it up by saying that I think that the pervasiveness of Dante in art has a lot to do with, as I said, his vivid imagery, but also that art doesn't have the barrier of language. And so it's a more universal medium. You don't have to translate art. A lot of people have tried to translate Dante. It's very difficult. And I think it becomes more accessible in many ways. And also that Dante remains an important figure in Boston because of the poets, the collectors, the scholars, the students. This is a place where people can study Dante. Some of the best translators of the Divine Comedy are in Boston still today, Lino Pertile being one of them. Obviously the 35 colleges in the city make it a great place to study Dante. Of course, the Dante Alighieri Society is a hub for Dante scholars and Dante aficionados. Its chapter dates back to 1911, so it's one of the very first in the United States. And so I just want to end with an anecdote that in 2009, I went to the Boston Berkeley Performance Center to see Roberto Benigni read The Inferno, and I was so impressed by the turnout. There were so many people there, probably some of you in the audience, and it just occurred to me that Dante is still very much present with us, and especially so in Boston. So I will end there and stop sharing my screen so that we can open it up for some questions. And I thank you very much for your time and attention.
Grazie tantissime Daniela. Mi sento un po' male che ti ho fatto parlare in inglese perché one of our guests is asking for Italian. But I have to say that we have so many people today and some of them cannot understand. So thank you for adapting, your presentation, which is fantastic. Thank you so much. I just wanted to ask you something and then, we will open the floor. But what was the actual name of Dante Gabriele Rossetti, who is one of the pre-Raffaelliti? Yeah. Now, you showed something, and I wonder I think there are more, which are probably not in Boston, but I'm pretty sure that the pre-Raffaelliti must have been fixated with Dante and Beatrice, So what was his name, if not Dante?
Yes, so it was actually Gabriele Dante, and then I think he had another middle name, Rossetti. So he just changed it. He changed
he switched. Yes. Okay.
Yes, exactly.
Bello, mi piace. Okay, so have a bunch of questions. I'm pretty sure you can see them.
Okay.
Maybe we can start from the Q&A.
Okay.
Paola Servino, she's a professor of Italian at Brandeis. I know her. Ciao Paola, che bello vederti. And she's asking in Italian quali sono i momenti, versi, temi del poema che sono stati maggiormente rappresentati nei secoli nelle varie forme artistiche.
So I'll answer in English if that's okay. I think that the parts of the poem that have most been represented in art, well, predominantly the Inferno. I mean, first to just start with the Inferno. The Inferno is probably the most read as well, the most, kind of famous, but it is also the most imaginative, if I dare say. It's really where Dante is presenting us with these amazing images, these amazing tortured souls, and just the things that happen in the Inferno. I mean, I always say images of hell are so much more interesting than images of heaven. There's these kind of, the violence and the gruesome spookiness. So, but to get more specific, Paola Francesca is a trope. I would say that as a literary, person, the most represented parts in literature are kind of studied parts in literature are also the ones represented most in art. So that's a kind of easy way to answer that, but
interesting. Plus the fascination for the Inferno, it's sort of cathartic for all of us, right? È un po' catartico vedere le tragedie altrui. Okay, and then Peter Barbella, is there a version of the comedy which includes an explanatory paragraph of each canto?
So as I said, I am not a Dante scholar, so I cannot answer that question. I'm sure there are many wonderful versions of the Divine Comedy that are that have, a kind of gloss, a kind of explanatory part. I myself have read Robert Pinsky, who is a still living translator and poet, but I'm not going to be the person, I'm sorry, to answer that the best way. So I'm sorry.
It's okay, that's okay. Let's see in the chat, and please, to the audience, feel free to ask some more questions. Yes, this I'm curious too, by James. But il naso di Dante, Dante's nose. I mean, how do we know about whether that shape was the right one or not?
Yeah, so it's a long story. Basically, it's based on not only the images that were painted of him or drawn of him in his life. I believe they also reconstructed his face based on his remains in Ravenna. So of course, what I didn't talk about, I had no time, but of course, Dante is famously exiled from Florence because of political reasons, and he dies in Ravenna. And so his burial site is still there. And there was a group of scientists who took his bones and reconstructed his face. It's based on part of that. It's also based on kind of some of the other death masks that are closer that were probably taken actually from his real face. But it's interesting that the hooked nose, I actually don't have a good explanation for why it persists, but it is the way that we think of Dante still today. Yeah. It just gets down.
I guess we could not think of Dante without that nose. Come on.
I think it has a lot to do, I think, with the aquiline nose standing for a kind of intellect and nobility. So it's more of an allegorical portrait. Yeah.
Interessante. Then, of course, you have a lot of compliments. You can read them all. Many people. In fact, Giulia Tombello is writing. Thank you, Ms. Carrabino, for the splendid lecture. I wish we had 2 hours.
I know. I ran. I know. It's so much.
I agree. A lot to talk about. Melody is asking, Melody the artist, I love this name, is asking, do you think that the Puvis de Chauvanet mural in the Boston Public Library might also have been influenced by Dante?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Puvis de Chavannes is another great artist of the 19th century. Yeah, I mean, this is where I'm taking a bit more license. It's not, this is not really my area that I can say for sure. I happen to think most images of hell are inspired by Dante. I think hell and inferno is synonymous with Dante. How can you not think of him, because he's been around for so long? So I mean, I think Puvis de Chavannes, seeing Sargent in the same space, and it's like when Raphael and Michelangelo were working in the Sistine Chapel. How can you not see each other working and be inspired? So it's very possible, but I'm not an expert in that area, so I can't say for sure. But it's a wonderful question.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. Thank you, Melody the artist. And then Sue is asking, and I like this question a lot too, I'm curious, is there a significance to Dante always shown in red?
I knew that was going to come up, and I'm not sure.
And actually, in the Dante Alighieri Society, nella Società Dante Alighieri, we have that little decoration that is red, and actually the logo is always black, white, and red.
And red, yeah. I don't know for sure. I have a guess, and again, it's a little bit out of my expertise here, but my guess is that he's wearing the robes of his political persona, because he was a politician. I think they were red in Florence to kind of distinguish themselves. I'm not 100% sure, but that's my guess, that it's to show his office.
Okay, interesting. Might be. Maybe we can ask Professor Lino Pertile when we'll have him again.
Yes.
And we should ask him also Deb's question, why didn't he marry Beatrice? And that is a question for Lino Pertile.
Yes.
Although, Beatrice married somebody else, married Folco Portinari. So, they were usually promessi, by the families. I don't think they could choose.
That's exactly right. No, it was a business transaction.
Exactly, exactly. Let me see the question again. Luciana is asking, sappiamo che anche Luciana Burdi, che saluto, she's a member of the board of the Dante of Massachusetts. Grazie Luciana di essere qui. E quindi Luciana is asking, sappiamo che anche Salvador Dalì fece delle bellissime illustrazioni della Divina Commedia. Che ci puoi dire di più dei suoi lavori di Dalì? Anche se immagino non siano a Boston, ma...
Che io sappia no, però non lo so. No, penso di no. So Salvador Dalì was a surrealist, which lends itself very well to Dante. Again, this kind of marriage between Dante and art. So Dalí, as a surrealist art is this kind of, it's painted in a naturalistic way, but it is very dreamlike. It has nothing to do with reality in the end. It's all kind of images put together that would never exist in nature, and a bit eerie, and which is very much the Divine Comedy itself, right? Because it's a journey through the afterlife, and it's something that we couldn't experience in our own lives. However, it is very much based in nature. And so there's this very nice, interesting kind of thematic relationship between surrealism and the Divine Comedy. So again, I would just say, I don't have images, so I can't go into much detail, but it's another way, it's another artist bringing the Divine Comedy into his own world, into his own time, making it his own. And I think that's something that I tried to touch on tonight, was that the Divine Comedy continues to influence artists, and it becomes renewed every time. It becomes current every time an artist does it. But it's a great question.
Sì, grazie Luciana. Then we have my great friend Marco Zanelli. He's been, with the Dante. He's a great actor here in Boston, and he's here with, always collaborated with the Dante Alighieri Society of Massachusetts. He's asking, where are the Dore, I don't know if I pronounce it well, works found?
Yes, so Gustave Doré is another, he's another French 19th century artist who illustrated, he created illustrations of Dante. The reason I didn't show them, we don't have any that I could find that were originally by Doré that are either illustrated or there's a series at Harvard that's after Doré. So it's an engraving series, but it's not Doré. It's an artist after Doré. And so I just thought it wouldn't be. But again, they're wonderful, very dark, very kind of moody. There's, I couldn't name all of them, but there are many artists who did series. And Doré is actually perhaps one of the more famous ones, but I couldn't find any in Boston that I could show tonight. So great point.
Okay, and Caterina Castellano, ciao Caterina, she's asking, are there any Dante-inspired drawings or paintings at the Boston Athenaeum, all'Ateneo?
That's a great question. Not that I know of, however, because I had to prepare this virtually from a distance, I didn't have the benefit of going and checking. And so I will just, as a disclaimer, say it's very possible that there are, because the Boston Athenaeum is a place where you would expect Dante to be, right? It makes sense that he would be there. However, I did not find any that I was able to access, at least virtually. So that's good for me. I will have to go back when it's, I'm able to and look.
Maybe in the future we could have a part 2 of your lecture. How about that? And maybe in person, going around different museums, a tour. Peter Barbella, sorry I skipped him, but I think it's his second questions. What is about Dante that brought Norton, Longfellow, Lowell, and Gardner together?
Yes. So Gardner was introduced to Norton by Bernard Berenson, and Bernard Berenson was an art historian. He was a student of Norton. Norton was the first art history professor, basically, at Harvard. His student, Bernard Berenson, went on to be a great collector in his own right. He and Isabella Stewart Gardner had a wonderful friendship. They brought a lot of art over from Italy. Actually, they worked very closely together. Bernard Berenson would buy art for Isabella Stewart Gardner and so forth. So that's how Gardner and Norton met. Longfellow and Norton, of course, worked at Harvard together. And then, of course, Lowell being a poet, and I think actually he also had a stint at Harvard. So they were all in the same circle. They were all poets. They were all interested in Italy. They were all interested in Dante, of course. And so it was a very kind of tight intellectual circle in the 19th century in Boston that they all very much knew each other, and very much fostered by Isabella Stewart Gardner. She would often invite people over and have these kind of soirees where people would discuss art and literature and music together.
Nice, un salon culturale,
Yes. Exactly.
Okay, my friends, I think this is it. I don't know if Susan and Adamo are still around and want to salutare.
Eccomi qua, Chiara, grazie a tutte per la vostra presenza e grazie infinite alla nostra carissima Daniela, favolosa.
Grazie a voi.
Grazie a tutti. Thank you for the outstanding lecture. It was very interesting. Buona serata a tutti voi. Grazie di nuovo.
Grazie Susan, grazie Adamo, really thank you very much for everybody, all of you, my friends who participated today, who connected with us, and last but not least Daniela, grazie di cuore, veramente presentazione bellissima. Io infatti non ne sapevo quasi niente e quindi ora so qualcosa in più. I'm very happy. Hopefully we can have you with us again. I really hope so. I think it would be fabulous. Grazie a tutti. I see many comments, but I will send you the chat to you so you can read all the compliments. I see you also have an alumna or somebody that graduated from the Smith College. So, you have a bunch of friends. Allora, the last thing I would like to add is that our next event with the Dante Alighieri Society in collaboration with the Dante Michigan and under the auspices of the Consolato Generale d'Italia in Boston e in Detroit will be June 6th at 6, and it's all about Italian dialects and regional languages. So you will hear not only some Italian, but a lot of dialects, if you're curious. And there will be also a lecture about, you know, the relationship between standard Italian and dialetti italiani, and a little bit of history about this kind of strange relationship. And then this will be a Zoom meetings, so it won't be a webinar in which we don't see our audience. We will all see each other, so please dress well. And so this way we can say goodbye before our summer break, and we can talk in Italian, we can talk in dialect, whatever you know. I don't know much, but you know. And so we will see, I guess, Adamo again there, or perhaps somebody else from the Consulate. And I hope to see you all on June 6th, il 6 giugno, domenica alle 6. Grazie ancora a Daniela, un abbraccio virtuale e arrivederci a tutti. Grazie della partecipazione dalla Dante Alighieri Society of Massachusetts.
Ciao
Ciao.
Chiara, ciao, ci si vede, ciao.
Grazie.